Hey there folks, the number one Oasis fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in my Rock Hall Reviews series for 2025. What is the Rock Hall Review series, you may be asking? It's a yearly series that I do on this channel where I talk about each of the current year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame nominees, review one album by each of them individually, and then I talk about if I think they deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and if I think they will get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Two questions that more frequently than you would probably ever expect have wildly different answers. And today I'm talking about Britpop legends, one of the most commercially successful, culturally important, and generally beloved British bands of all time, Oasis, and their massively acclaimed debut studio album, Definitely Maybe, or at least maybe their most acclaimed. What's the Story Morning Glory is also there too, but you know, I want to talk about the debut instead. Just cut me some slack here, okay? Let's just be real for a second. Most of the world, when they think of the term Britpop, think of Oasis. I mean, sure, you can have all of your Blur versus Oasis kind of conversations that you want, and huge dorks like myself that just have to be different generally prefer Pulp and Suede. I know, because I do prefer Pulp and Suede, but as a whole, sonically, stylistically, aesthetically, Oasis represent Britpop. Let's face it, they won at the end of the day, at least on a global scale. I can't really speak for any of my British viewers here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, Oasis are the ones that are having songs sung in stadiums the globe across, and generally speaking, they are one of the most popular British bands of all time. But honestly, I can see why. They've had a pretty long and storied career at this point, and while I do agree with a lot of people that believe they ended up kind of burning out pretty quick after only a few studio albums, I'm still glad to honestly just see them around and performing. I can see the massive fan base that they have, the cult-like status that a lot of Oasis followers have found themselves obtaining over time, and really from a musical perspective based on melodies and sonic aesthetic alone, it's not hard to see why Oasis are such an appealing band to people that like heavier guitar-based music that's nonetheless still very ear-friendly, sort of ear candy, if you will, radio-ready, and extremely catchy most of all. And that all really started with Definitely Maybe, not necessarily their most popular album in every country, I guess that really depends on who you ask, but it is the great start of a career that would go on to produce some absolutely astoundingly good and astoundingly mediocre music alike. I think at their core, a big reason why Oasis so quickly became a beloved band upon the release of Definitely Maybe is because they really did just feel like a band of talented and ambitious young musicians with a raw sound that they wanted to share with the world in any way that they could. And that's because that is what they were. And you really can hear that on Definitely Maybe. I mean, from the second that the record opens up with the classic rock and roll star, you get this kind of rollicking and intense yet still highly accessible sound that would not only go on to define the general ideas associated with Britpop by the mainstream at least, but a lot of the mainstream alternative rock scene of the UK for another decade, like decade and a half almost. My point is that from the moment this record starts, you can really hear the sheer youth and energy being poured into this record, and from a musical perspective, everything is great here. From the solid rhythm section to the Gallagher brothers' tension kind of making this into an album that has a certain lovability and intensity to it overall, it just makes a record feel that much more genuine, because at the end of the day, it was genuine. It was just some kids from the UK that wanted to make some interesting, unique, melodic music, and that's exactly what they did. And even if this isn't necessarily your style, your sound, not something that you personally can find yourself connecting with on an emotional or generally musical level, I think it's hard not to appreciate just how earnest this record feels at the end of the day. Definitely Maybe does do a lot to sell itself as something different, though. I mean, that primarily comes in the form of some of those more psychedelic influences that feel arguably heavier here than they ever really did again in Oasis's discography. Not necessarily saying that this is their best album, though a lot of people would probably say that it is. That is entirely up for a debate that I'm not going to get into. but I would say it's almost inarguable that Oasis never really got this trippy, per se, ever again. Not to say that this is some absolutely insane Captain Beefheart-style insanity, but at the same time, there are a lot of neo-psychedelic moments here that you don't necessarily get as often or as frequently on later Oasis albums, especially as the 21st Century hit, but there are plenty of tracks here that do embrace those, again, more sonically psychedelic kind of moments, whether you go with tracks like Slide Away or Cigarettes and Alcohol, the guitar tones and the general atmosphere that you could certainly feel was being built around a sound almost adjacent to the kind of shoegaze and more large wall of sound side of the indie rock scene of the era, both in the UK and the United States. It just makes for a record that feels unique in the context of Oasis's discography, and especially unique in the context of popular rock music in the UK at the time. And honestly, I think that some of the band's best songs are here. I mean, the obvious picks are tracks like Live Forever and Supersonic, the former of which I would honestly say is probably their best song overall, as someone who has listened to their full discography at this point, which is absolutely insane that they made one of the most beautiful songs in, a few minutes on their debut album. Wild stuff there. But, as a whole, there's no real misses here. Even the somewhat controversial Digsy's Dinner, I find myself enjoying quite a bit, even if it is really kind of the weakest track on the record. And there are some weaker moments here. I mean, Digsy's Dinner, not my favorite track in the world, and a song like Columbia, while good, compared to the rest of the album and the highlights here, is a bit take it or leave it overall, but I think there's a lot of underrated cuts here, too. I mean, Married with Children, Bring It On Down, those are some of the best songs that Oasis ever put out, in my opinion, and that's saying a lot because those first two albums are chock full of great songs after great songs, with a few masterpieces sprinkled in there in both cases. I mean, What's the Story, Morning Glory was an amazing follow-up, of course, but I would argue that the peaks here on Definitely Maybe, although I don't consider this album better than Morning Glory, definitely are higher here, with, again, a couple of my favorite songs, not only of Oasis's catalog, but generally of the entire UK's musical history being found here on this album. And from that point onward, I mean, Oasis's career is pretty heavily storied. I mean, the lineup changed from time to time, the Gallagher brothers found new ways to threaten and or assault each other, and they went from being one of the most beloved bands on the planet to a somewhat polarizing band, critically speaking. I mean, sure, Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory are classics and definitive albums of music in the 90s, period, but Be Here Now in 1997 was undeniably a controversial album, and many consider it to be Oasis's dying breath for a lot of reasons, at least creatively. And after that, records like Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, for example, just never really reached that same creative spark that they did early on as young, blossoming musicians. And while you could make the argument that 2008's Dig Out Your Soul, their last studio album, as of date, may I remind you, did manage to kind of bring back some of that life by really upping some of those psychedelic elements that you do interestingly find here on Definitely Maybe. They never followed it up, and since then, it has been, in terms of studio work, really mostly radio silence from them. And while I am happy to see Oasis back on the road, and do think that what I just said could be completely incorrect in a couple of years' time if they choose to get back into the studio and put out another full-length LP, as it stands, I feel like Oasis's career has been, at least in the studio, left on somewhat of a cliffhanger. A couple of near masterpiece classic records that have some highlights, and a couple of weaker tracks here or there, and then a slew of kind of unmemorable Britpop mush that never really lived up to the era-defining status that they did rightfully achieve with those first couple of records. But nonetheless, to go back to Definitely Maybe, their 1994 debut, excellent album. I don't know what else to say. Some of their best work is on here, couple of good, not great tracks, but as a whole, really excellent album, and while I personally do prefer Morning Glory, I could never really fault anyone for saying that Definitely Maybe is Oasis at their peak. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Now, do I think Oasis deserve to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Absolutely. They are not only the definitive Britpop band on an international scale, but they also put out some of the most iconic songs of the 90s, even if you completely removed Wonderwall from their discography, which I think, depending on the Oasis fan, may actually be a preferred option, that you would still have one of the most beloved catalogs of that entire decade in terms of singles alone. And not only that, but they are still a massively popular stadium-level band. I'm pretty sure the world was about to collapse in on itself myself from the excitement that came about when they announced that they were going on tour again. I mean, Jesus Christ, the amount of impact that Oasis have had over the decades is nothing short of astonishing, and no matter how much the Gallagher brothers intend to insult each other on social media, or insult their fans on social media, or insult other musicians on social media, etc., their legacy will never really be changed. I mean, Oasis are still the face of post-Beatles British music, arguably. They are still the face of the 90s in the UK's mainstream, at the very least, on, again, a global scale, not necessarily in the UK itself. And as a whole, I just don't see any reason why someone wouldn't want them to be inducted. And I think that once they do get their inevitable induction, either this year or next year, I could see some other British bands coming in, taking their place on the ballot, maybe a Coldplay type band or something like that, but none of those bands will ever quite reach the same level of success on every level possible, in the same way that Oasis have and continue to do so to this day. Now, do I think Oasis will get in? That's a bit of a tricky question, admittedly. A few years ago, I would have said, honestly, probably not. Because the thing is, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame being a, center, being an institution rooted in the United States, in Cleveland, they've never really been super great towards recognizing British music, which is crazy to think that British music is underrepresented in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but it really did take that long for a lot of the most influential British bands to be inducted. Bands like T-Rex and Roxy Music, for example, took decades before they even got nominated, let alone inducted. And honestly, you still see a lot of noted British and generally just English artists that still aren't recognized by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame via nomination or induction. And I think that you could make the argument that that will honestly just worsen in future years, as Britpop still has not been recognized in any way. There's no way in hell that the UK electronic boom of the 90s is going to be recognized in any way, unless we get like a nomination for The Prodigy, maybe. And honestly, as we go into the 2000s and the Hall's seeming reluctance to go for turn-of-the-century artists like the White Stripes and Linkin Park, US staples of mainstream radio here, I can't really see them going for UK acts like the Libertines or even the Arctic Monkeys that quickly either. So as it stands, I would say it's a 50-50 shot. On one hand, Oasis are touring again, they're on the tips of everyone's tongue, massively popular, maybe more popular than ever even, between their original generation of fans and a younger generation of fans more within my age range discovering and falling in love with their body of work. But at the same time, I don't know, the Hall's always been a bit more keen on inducting United States acts, and as a whole, it's a very US institution, so I don't know, maybe a lot of the voters won't be that interested in voting for Oasis, but if it doesn't happen this year, it'll happen soon, because similar to how I think that the Hall refused to nominate other rap artists until they inducted A Tribe Called Quest last year, I kind of think that they're going to refuse to nominate any other major UK mainstream rock bands until they get Oasis in, knowing that they're probably risking, I don't know, a bunch of British people flying over to Cleveland and, rioting if, say, Coldplay, just as an example, once again, got in before Oasis did. So I think it's going to happen within a year or two if it doesn't happen now, but I wouldn't be totally shocked if they got inducted this year as well. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.